Welcome to One Mic, where I add perspective to different podcasts that I listen to. It's not a review of the podcast, it's just where I choose one or two topics from the podcast and add my perspective to it. And on today's episode, the first episode, I wanted to add perspective to the Joe Budden podcast, a Patreon episode by the name of Rockabye Baby, where Imani brought the topic of past friends and their animosity towards one another once the relationship doesn't work out and years have passed. Why is it still animosity? And in his story, he tells a story of him being in LA, him seeing Marissa, and once he started having a conversation with her, he brought up that he was on the Joe Budden podcast at this point, and I guess she gave off a tone of it's like she didn't have no feelings toward the podcast itself, but she definitely still wasn't feeling Joe. So when Imani brought that back to the podcast, he clearly stated, I don't want to misinterpret her tone towards the podcast and its success. I just really feel she may have still felt a way toward Joe. And answering that question, I just want Imani to know that you may feel a way towards a person you have a breakup with in any circumstance, just simply because of how the breakup happened. You know, if you felt mistreated, done wrong, if you felt like this person didn't give you a chance to speak your mind, this person is mixed characterized you, especially to the public or anything of that nature, depending on how volatile the breakup was, 10 years, 15, 5 years later, whenever the time frame is, you definitely can still feel a way if you feel slighted. But this show is more so to address Ish and Ice's stance and add perspective to it. Like I said, this is not a bashing portion. I just, I mean, it's another mic, so I just want to add my perspective to the particular topic. And Ish's stance was, Ish and Ice's stance was, it probably has a lot to do with Joe's success, being that Marissa was fired from the podcast. And the perspective I wanted to add to Ish and Ice, and maybe you respond, maybe you don't, is the fact that y'all are forgetting that when I'll name this podcast later started, there was no space where you entered, you got a podcast and you said, we're gonna become multimillionaires. We're gonna become these big personalities. When I'll name this podcast later started, it was more so a group of friends getting together saying, yo, let's make a move and let's do this and do that. Even if the conversation is maybe we can create a space, there was no proven entity out there that this was just valuable means. Understand, Joe was still rapping. Other people still had their jobs and all of this. Peter Rosenberg was there. He still worked at Hot 97. It wasn't a thing of, yo, we're gonna get into podcasting, and now we're gonna make all this amounts of money. So your analogy ish of two people getting in to a real estate business together, and they buy a couple homes, and one end up leaving the other, and then one becomes this real estate mogul, and the other one still selling, have their six houses, and that person may still feel a way toward the other person because you obviously see the success. Real estate is a proven entity. It's not the same as podcasting. So yes, when you and your man got into real estate, your projection may have been coming to take over. It may have not been, but let's just say it was. Y'all had something to base it off of. Podcasting in itself had, there was no basis to say we're gonna become this thing. Even after Marissa was fired, right? Maul stepped in. Joe Budden is on record to say with Joe, Maul, and Rory, there was no money in it before the Spotify deal. It I remember them having a couple ads or whatever, but there was no money. Nobody was getting paid. Nobody was just becoming these big stars. Joe Budden already had a social media presence. Back to Joe Budden TV. You was on Joe Budden TV. You didn't become a star off of Joe Budden TV. You was still working out here and doing your own thing. Not that you look to be a star in that. You and Joe had a falling out. I'm not saying it was as volatile or you felt so wrong that you couldn't make it right. Obviously, y'all made it right, but what I'm saying that to lead into my next point of perspective is why Marissa was fired. You stated that part of Marissa's animosity, not saying there was, we're just using her as an example at this point. Part of her animosity was because she was fired as the podcaster. But what I wanted to add to that is the fact that she may have been fired as a part of the podcast, but that may not be the reason why she was fired. It may not been your performance on the podcast is lacking, so I'm firing you. Your contribution to the podcast is lacking, so I'm firing you. It could simply be yo, whatever happened off the podcast between Marissa and Joe, it's his podcast. Yo, don't come back to the podcast. I don't want to be around you. Now I'm bringing to the podcast. Yo, I fired Marissa. Don't expect her to come back. So she may not feel, she doesn't have to feel away because of the success of the podcast. Because she probably got fired, or her and Joe's falling out had nothing to do with the podcast. And when they try to explain, when Imani and Melissa Ford tried to explain this to you, you really didn't get it. So, like I said, I'm kind of adding that perspective to your take, and just understand Joe agreed with that. And like I said, it just, I'm just adding this because you really didn't. It felt like you really wasn't really receiving or getting how a person can have a falling out that had nothing to do with the podcast. And now that we are on a podcast together, I can just say, yo, I don't want to work with you. Don't come back. But again, this is not a review. This is just a perspective on certain topics I want to add a perspective to. And I definitely be doing this more than just the Joe Budden podcast. And I just want to say thank you, and I'm out.